great, we're made of stardust. Now what?
And everyone would be, hugging each other. And it would be great.
Well, that's depressing.
We do try not to just bash everything, but we're not very good at it's all we seem to be able to do. So sorry about that. We are trying.
Welcome to episode 5 of Wisdom in Exile Radio. Thanks for your comments previously, and John and Vera and so on. Really appreciate the feedback, and please everyone, really appreciate any thoughts you have on the podcast, and also any suggestions about any areas you want us to cover in more detail going forward. This week we're going to wrap up on chapter 2, and there's a number of points that Lama Jampa raises in terms of what is creating that space for Buddhism. And the first one, which is interesting, he says, we can't go back, in which he's really referencing we can't go back to Christianity. And with that, maybe Adrian, do you want to give your thoughts on what he really means by that?
I think Lama Jampa is talking about you can't turn the clock back. Once the genie is out of the bottle with not just Christianity, but believing in God, because we've gone through the Protestant Reformation, we've gone through the Enlightenment. I have heard people say, quite a few people say, they really wish that they could be religious because they do feel the loss or the absence of something in their lives, and they would like to believe in something. But you can't force yourself to believe in Christianity. It's too late. You can't go back there. And one other observation I make about this is I think if it was just a question of being able to return to theism, Islam would be far more popular in the West among native Europeans. There's been a lot of Islamic migration into the West, especially into Europe. And so a lot of teachers have come across, and there's a big opportunity to learn about it. But whereas Buddhism has had Buddhist countries have had a relatively tiny amount of migration into the West, but Buddhism has been popular among Westerners, but Islam has not. Why is that? I think one reason is because Europe and America are kind of over the belief in theism. So slightly controversial, but that's just
controversial. But also I think for our viewers or listeners, isn't it? I think there is a bit of a difference between the US population and England and Europe. And so obviously the three of us were brought up in England, but all live now in the US. And certainly I've found that there's far more people who happily proclaim themselves as Christian and who go to church regularly. They even do Bible study regularly. So I think there is a difference there in the US and in Europe.
Lama mentions we can't go back, can't turn back the clock. And it feels like that's a comment about trying to repackage theism into something that is like, where did it go wrong? And how can we then repackage it in a way that fits with our modern times, and our modern times being defined by Enlightenment thought, which is reason and rationalism. And how can we do that? But we can't. And then that's the whole point. And that's the whole point of this chapter has been the rise of rationalism, the rise of reason pretty much destroyed theism. It couldn't stand up to that scrutiny. So you can't go back to theism and then say, well, let's add the framework of rationalism to then resell it to people. It doesn't work.
Yeah, there's another thing you can't do, which is exactly what we talked about in the French Revolution. You can't create a new religion just because you want one. They tried to do that, the cult of reason. Remember, we talked about that. And they even set up temples, and they had festivals, new calendar, and so on. And it just didn't take. People's hearts weren't in it. Religion has to come from transcendental principle, like in our case, the Buddha. But you can't just do it through a politician saying, we need something, let's have this will do, have that.
It's a really good point about the cult of reason. Because the evolution of that, although it was short-lived, it then became the cult of the supreme being after the cult of reason. This kind of idolatry of individualism, of materialism. The person, the individual, the human, is now what Paul had mentioned in last episode. Was that we've killed God and we've replaced it with man. Man has become the supreme being.
There's another way that the modern world tries to compensate for the disappearance of the transcendental, which is in science. They say, oh, science is beautiful. You know, your atoms were all formed in stars, supernovas, or something like that.
Talking about David Krauss, the quantum physicist, who said, we're made of stardust.
Great, we're made of stardust. Now what?
The attraction of that statement is that it implies that we're all connected. You know, it's that whole coexist bumper sticker. It's that there's the new religion is that we're all connected. We're all one family, even the stars and the planets. It's this kind of new age spirituality.
Yeah. But it's also that it does have a hint of truth to it in terms of continuity. And like we're part of something that is sort of goes back in eternity. But the problem is it's just matter, i.e. bit of dirt, which is very compelling when life is not more than just being a bit of dirt.
But there's a longing in modern culture among a lot of people. Some people are just perfectly happy with Amazon and Netflix, but I think obviously not everyone. There's a longing in a lot of people for something more and something greater.
You know, I think it sounds like there's in a way three groups of people nowadays. There are Christians who identify as Christians and actually have some faith. And I think for them, actually, there isn't much space for Buddhism, which is fair enough. You know, they've got their religion. Maybe it can't be grounded in reason, but it can be grounded in a leap of faith, like Thomas Aquinas said. And then you've got people who like completely into their Netflix and Amazon and gaming or whatever it is. They just haven't got any space or time to even think about anything more transcendental like Buddhism. And then there's people who might be open to Buddhism.
Even among the Christians and the Netflixers, or whatever we should call them. Probably if Buddhism could be a bit more mainstream in modern culture, I think a lot would start to come over, because I think a lot of them probably feel a lack even in their Christianity and in their Netflix. It just papers over the problem, doesn't it? But because they don't see anything else, they'll stick with it for the time being. But it's part of the space of Buddhism to say that because those things are so inadequate among even the people who are engaged in them, that they would come over to Buddhism if we could just get into the mainstream a bit more. But we're so absent from the mainstream that it's not happening right now.
This chapter outlines the space for Buddhism, and it also outlines some of the obstacles very clearly. And when you're talking about Netflix and Amazon, video gaming, I think social media as well. But these are all, I think, what the Lama referred to, the pleasure of forgetfulness. They're kind of short-term forms of pleasure and distraction that do away with the necessity to really think about anything transcendent. You know, binging on Netflix series, and you know, that's great. They're quite distracting. I've watched Breaking Bad, but it doesn't. Or then at the end of it, then you're left with, now what? You know, now I've completely watched every season of Game of Thrones. I'm back to, like, you know, being stuck in my head, and it's a symptom of materialism that doesn't look for any kind of long-term answers. It looks for short-term fixes. You see it in medicine all the time. We attack things from a very kind of symptomatic or short-term approach, not looking at the longitudinal effects of things like cardiovascular disease and obesity. We have this billion-dollar industry for blood pressure medication, but nobody's really that interested in doing any exercise. You know, and it's kind of the same thing. No one wants to do the work. We just want a short-term fix. We want to pop a pill, turn on Netflix, get our Amazon orders, and just sit back.
You touched on so many points there. I think you're right, isn't it? We live in one of the most prolifically consumerist societies, isn't it? Where we've sort of perfected the way of engaging people's short-term interest into wanting something and engaging with something. And then it's like almost a relentless stream of extra stuff to engage us. And so, yeah, that forgetfulness of pleasure, I think, yeah, a lot of people will fall for that. And it's a bit like you can spend your whole life like almost sleeping through life until you get towards the end of it and think, you start getting sick and approaching death and think, oh shit, what have I been doing with myself? But
yeah, it's not just the forgetfulness of pleasure, though. Lama ties it into the fact that it's eroding away at the ability or the space for stillness and contemplation when in the rapidity of social media as well.
And just coming back to Adrian's earlier point, which also I thought was quite interesting, was around Islam versus Christianity. Because although, like I said, I think there's a lot of people in the US in particular where people are Christian, their conviction is quite different from I think, it would have been in medieval times and so on, where people really believed in it, in the Bible, and it talks about you could die and you're going to go to hell or heaven. They actually think that's for real. And so on. Whereas nowadays it seems so watered down. I don't know if it does have the same appeal as like say Islam seems more, people really believe it, and there's really is a very different faith-based view of the world, which might be more engaging for some people. I don't know.
One characteristic of these faith-based religions is you sort of have to convince yourself that you believe it for it to work. All the Abrahamic religions are like that, aren't they? It's like, oh, if you find yourself doubting, you're failing. I mean, the Protestant Reformation was salvation through faith alone, not works. So if you find yourself losing your faith, and you might have very good reasons for doing so, it's got this kind of built-in resistance to that, where it's like, no, you just need to have more faith. So I don't think that's the difference between any of the Abrahamic religions.
I think the difference between Islam and Christianity, at least Christianity in America, is more about that trying to create heaven on earth and the work. Whenever you see, like the cartoon criticisms of America, it's always like the capitalism, the dollar sign, and I think that is one of Islam's contentions against and differences in Christianity, is that it trying to set itself apart a little bit more from the material world, whereas Christianity, I think, is trying to meet materialism and find some happy medium for it. It's like it's all about the afterlife, and it's not at all about heaven on earth.
Yeah, but there's a good point there. I think, isn't it, in like in Sakya, the passing from the four attachments, the Jampa Thaye teaching is in the first point. If you have attachments to this life, you're not a religious person. I mean, it's generally obviously talking about being a Buddhist. If you're concentrating on this life, you're not effectively a Buddhist, but you could see it actually applying to all religions, actually. That's sort of the difference between secular materialism, where everything's just matter, you die and, your eternal bliss of nothingness, versus nearly all the religious traditions. The transcendence is about there's something which isn't reducible to material process and which continues after death.
So there's 4 points, right, that really sum up.
Yeah, so maybe we should move on. The first point Lama Jampa makes: Buddhism provides a solid foundation for ethics based on experience and reason, i.e. karma, and not the divine will of a god. So I don't know if someone wants to say a bit more about what Lama Jampa is getting at.
Well, there is no moral philosophy attached to materialism, I think, was the inference from that. That materialism is just materialism, or rationalism even is just rationalism, or science is just science. There is no, Lama says, you can be Jewish, Buddhist, or, you can have any philosophical background and be a scientist. Science alone doesn't have any kind of code of ethics, medical ethics, but it doesn't really have a moral underpinning. Take away the morality that came with Christianity, which it was the foundations of our society. You take that away, give us reason and science, but you haven't really got a basis or a philosophical basis for any morality. And that's where the space for Buddhism comes on, because
that's right. That's the sort of Nietzschean point, that which Nietzsche was quite prescient to see this, that if God is dead and Christianity is no longer viable, what is our moral framework? What's the basis of any kind of moral action? And what seems to have happened is Christianity has kind of, it's been in decline, and nothing else has really come up apart from materialism to replace it. Certainly no moral alternative, serious moral alternative. But its moral frameworks have continued, that sort of momentum of Christianity continued in its moral compass. We left out God. But, I think that especially in the political sphere, communism, socialism, even nowadays you have this kind of capitalistic corporate social responsibility. These all have a Christian feel to them. Their morality is somewhat Christian. But because the Christian basis is gone, they're all morphing and mutating, and as new ideas come up, and they're turning into quite strange.
The companies I've worked for over the years have held, they've had these mission statements or like pillars, and these are these kind of corporate ideas where they have this kind of very kind of series of compelling words that define them. Things like compassion, integrity. It's like it's a search there for some kind of like moral underpinning to them, saying it's like, look, we're not just about, we realize that we're essentially a company making money, but we're trying to say, look, actually we do have some morals.
But it is quite, dare I say, a little bit cynical, isn't it? Because they know that people are motivated and engaged in something which is about people and feeling good about themselves and feeling they help others. And so, yeah, it's a very conscious effort, maybe partly following some of the big tech companies have been very successful in this and making people feel they're part of something bigger, working for the betterment of society, and therefore feeling morally righteous about it. But as Adrian said, it's so derivative of Christianity because it assumes this linear progression of history, approaching the end of history where, like we spoke before about millenarianism, this idea that we can create this utopia on Earth. If we make the external world somehow ideal, everyone can live in happiness and everyone will be, hugging each other. And it would be great. And but it really is. It's amazing how, even though God is dead, as we said, like Nietzsche said, then these cultural aspects continue and permeate ethics and values, like you say.
Yeah, but you also have the change aspect, the mutating aspect, which results in these kind of these constant moral panics that the modern society has every couple of years.
It shifts with the wind. Yeah,
there's a weakness now in culture, and it's manifesting in it. There's an obvious need for a moral basis. But there is no moral basis. There's no basis to any of this morality. Yeah, you got your Rousseau, and now there's all these modern theorists from grievance studies and so on, trying to come up. But again, they can point back to a period in history maybe, but they can never point to a fundamental basis of right and wrong. That's again the space for Buddhism, because Buddhism has a fundamental outside of history basis for right and wrong, which is the karma actions and the origin of suffering, which is ignorance.
Like a lot of the academic theories around like right now, like critical race theory, are looking and seeing the flaws in theories of reason that went before them, and they're seeing that the more you focus on the external world, it's a bit of a rabbit hole. It's like a Russian doll. You just keep opening it, and you find more things to kind of critique and criticize and obsess about, and say, oh, this is the source of our problem, but it's all external. And I think there's even partly a recognition that, well, perhaps we're looking in the wrong place and we need to look internally. And so you see these the popularity of the secular mindfulness movements, which is like, we do actually need to make an internal change. So let's do some mindfulness and make our self a better, more functional citizen.
Well, even the mindfulness thing is not truly internalizing, because they're constantly looking to science for some kind of support for their theories. I mean, we're going to get into this next time, so we won't go into it. But but mindfulness and the neuroscience, just Google mindfulness and neuroscience, see how many hits you get. It'll be a lot.
Consciousness and science.
Yeah, well, that's the next chapter, isn't it? So next week we'll start on science and that sort of topics. Maybe then we should move on to the next point Lama Jampa makes for the space of Buddhism, which is Buddhism provides a repertoire of contemplative and meditative techniques that support spiritual experience without recourse to theism. Any thoughts on that?
We have touched on that a few times already, so maybe we can do this one quite quickly. But yeah, it's about the absence of meditative practice. One thought I had was, it's quite interesting, the language around this point is always described as the absence in the Western tradition of meditation and contemplation. But actually, those words aren't quite right, because both meditation and contemplation, the English words I mean, imply thoughts, conceptualization, thinking, mulling over. Contemplation and meditation both have that meaning, actually, of having a thought and focusing on that thought, fleshing it out, thinking about alternatives and possibilities. So, but what's real, and actually, so Lama Jampa mentions this in chapter 2. What meditation, the word in Sanskrit was bhavana, and he actually explains, although he doesn't say bhavana, but he does point out that what is really meant by this word in the Buddhist tradition is bringing into being. Actually, that's what actually bhavana means, bringing an experience into being. So although the Western tradition certainly has a lot of, in the ordinary senses of the word, meditation and contemplation, almost too much, it doesn't have this tradition of bhavana, i.e. turning something into turning an idea into an internal experience and actually changing the way you understand and experience the world.
It's building on that slightly, isn't it? I think Lama Jampa mentions how certainly there's no tradition that's had such a systematic and rich tradition of different meditative techniques and contemplations that can be used. So it's just so fundamental to any of the traditional systems of training in Buddhism, isn't it? You have a mix of sort of sitting type concentration meditations where you stabilize the mind to allow you, in a way, the space to sort of examine mind and concepts and thoughts and emotions and feelings and what's happening. And then you've got the sort of the rich sort of philosophical works of, I think we mentioned Nagarjuna and Chandrakirti and others, which give a very sophisticated way of trying to analyze one's experience and what's really happening. And the two of those combined, isn't it, is come abiding techniques and vipassana or insight techniques. Together they create that experiential realization. So to your point, I guess Christianity, maybe a lot of, I think Islam and certainly Hinduism, they have elements of these, but I guess in the Buddhist tradition, it's just so sophisticated and systematic, and just a very powerful techniques and systems of training it's possible to follow.
Yeah, it's incredible, actually, that the people, and Lama Jampa again mentions this in the book, that there's this huge corpus of material and work over 2,500 years on meditation in the Buddhist tradition. Hardly any of it has been translated yet. So there's all that potential. And again, going back to the space of Buddhism, there's a longing for it in the West. There's people, a lot of people beginning to realize, and so you see this in their searching with the popularity of yoga, of course. Unfortunately, that's generally more of a physical sort of stretching exercise. But I think most yoga classes also incorporate a sort of spiritual, simple, nod towards the non-conceptual and the transcendental. But another area I notice where there's a longing for a meditative experience is in the popularity of these Vipassana retreats. I think everyone knows someone who's done one of these 10-day Vipassana retreats. And I don't know what it is about them that has really caught the imagination of people in the modern world. Maybe it's this idea that it's only 10 days, and if I could just get through it.
Yeah, I mean, I've had a lot of people, come into our a Sakya Center in classes who've done, you know, Vipassana retreats. So I've spoken to quite a few people about it. So it seems to come, is it from more of the Burmese tradition? I think it is, but it's like, it's not what in Mahayana Buddhism we call Vipassana, insight meditation. It's actually shamatha. It's more calm abiding meditation, and it's really, I can't remember exactly how many hours, maybe 4 or 5 sessions, a couple of hours sitting meditation. And they always talk about how brutal it is, you know, how difficult it is, and yeah, you've got to, like, you know, you've got to, yeah, you do it, you know, you get through it, and it's sort of like a badge of honor that you've gone through it because it's so tough.
Suffer
And
through
so
it.
perversely, in Buddhist teachings and like the 7 points, you know, the whole point of the only point of Buddhism Dharma practice is to let go of ego clinging. But in this case, it's sort of like, it becomes like an adornment. Maybe that's a bit harsh. I'm sure not everyone's like that, but it does seem like that. And what people, if they can get through one, often what they want to do is, oh, I'm going to do another one next year. Or, you know, I've done 3 Vipassana retreats. It's sort of like some sort of like badge of honor.
It is like some kind of mind over matter, extremist weirdness. Like I'm going to sit through the pain no matter what. You know, you just drive a spike through my hand, and I'm just going to sit here and grin and bear it, because it's some kind of like Zen, David Carradine kung fu type of like. I'm just transcend it. It's just physical pain.
I mean, maybe we'll come back to this in the future. Well, we will come back to this in the future.
I'm still smiling over Adrian's explanation of what yoga is. It's physical stretching exercise.
I've never actually been to a yoga class. I'll probably, if you want to correct me in the comments, I'll.
No, I mean,
that's fine.
there's probably a few people out there that are like, well, there's some.
But, just quickly on the Vipassana thing, maybe there's something there around. I think maybe some Westerners like sort of, yeah, like Norin was saying, this the punishment, because they like to run marathons, don't they, and do Ironman.
Good and bad there, isn't there? Because there's something around self-discipline and determination can be a good thing, you know, if it's directed in the right way. And in some ways, yes, I don't want to diss it completely, but I think it's just a bit like, but where's it going? You know what I mean? These things, yeah, okay, you've done a fascia street, and so what's that really got you? Or like, say, if you do a marathon as well.
Well, it does come from the Burmese tradition, but even there, it was a sort of 19th century, perhaps not invention, but re-emphasizing a teaching which had definitely fallen out of common practice. But what happened after, you know, how it was taken up by Western traditions, I don't think was necessarily in accord even with the 19th century tradition. But,
to go back, your point about there being a need for meditative contemplative practice, and that there hasn't been a system as sophisticated, or you'd be hard pressed to find one, as Buddhism. So you see that then people are like, oh, so let's co-opt that completely and take those elements and make them our own, and use them for our own benefit as Buddhism's trickled over.
Yeah, well, I think that's consumerism, isn't it? And for reference, isn't it? Because I know sometimes we call that materialism nowadays. You know, everyone just been caught up with stuff. I know we've been talking about philosophical materialism, which is the belief of everything in matter. But normal materialism or consumerism, I think you're right. It's so one of the dangers, isn't it, for Buddhism, which I'm sure we'll come back to again, is that, you know, you take some Buddhist stuff, package it up, repackage it, and see if you can make some money out of it. And that's happening all over the place in the West, and really corrupting it. And then that makes Buddhism very open to criticism, which actually isn't really valid. But you've got so many people calling themselves Buddhists and doing these things that it does damage, I think, the tradition essentially.
You know, we do try not to just bash everything, but we're not very good at it's all we seem to be able to do. So sorry about that. We are trying, believe it or not.
Yeah, that sort of wisdom maybe.
What's the third point?
Third point. Yeah, so the third point Lama Jampa raises in the conclusion is around how Buddhism provides a sophisticated system of reason in a philosophical system that reinstates the importance of human subjectivity in the transcendence and not the blind mechanics of materialist scientism. Thoughts?
Subjectivity and scientism, two interesting issues. Like subjectivity is actually recognized to some degree in science. You have that qualitative research where they seek out the more of a subjective opinion and viewpoint, but it doesn't. It's like how do you reconcile empiricism and rational thought with the fact that we're humans with bias? It always comes back to, like we mentioned in the last episode, that the people carrying out scientific experiments are humans, and that they have defilements or biases or whatever you want to call them. And so you can't extract that, where you can, but then where does that leave you? It leaves you in this very kind of clinical, machine, artificial intelligence world, which is, then again, you go down the rabbit hole of algorithms that are then programmed by subjective humans. It's just almost impossible to eradicate subjectivity. And so we see that there's room for subjectivity in Buddhism, that it's not something that we're trying to kill,
Yeah, that desire to eliminate subjectivity is, I think, as you rightly pointed to, a consequence of the Enlightenment. And at the time, it seemed like a great idea. And it was part of the optimism of the Enlightenment. They thought, we can eliminate subjectivity, let's do that, and that we will be enlightened. But of course, not only was it impossible, but to the extent that it was achieved, it just led to the dominance of machines, the inhuman treatment of animals, and all the other horrors of the materialistic mind. So now I think in the modern world, you have, we've always had the dissenters, as we said last time, but you still have people pointing to the loss of subjectivity as a loss of something very important, and also the same with the loss of transcendence. Obviously, people are recognizing it's not enough just to watch Netflix and have Amazon deliveries. There's something missing, and they can look back to the old world and see, well, they had something. But as we said, you can't turn the clock back. So the space of Buddhism around this is the need is there, the recognition is even there that there's something missing in the transcendent.
Yeah. And that's the thing, is that people can't buy. Ultimately, I think people can't fully swallow scientism. Everything just matter, because it so contradicts our moment-to-moment experience of the world, which is rich. It's our conscious experience. Try and reduce it to an explanation in terms of molecules and particles, and that you lose what it is to exist and to experience the world. And there is something really transcendent which people confront every day or experience every day. So I think, yeah, so Buddhism, to your point, it's interesting though on the Western side, Western philosophy, because as well as the Enlightenment, you've got the end of the Enlightenment and post-Enlightenment and then postmodern movement, where you get some really interesting stuff where in some ways subjectivity comes back in, and the realization that whole collapse of things, subject and object, is actually itself a sort of a delusion. And maybe this is a bit of a segue, but I remember one of my favorite philosophers before I came to Buddhism was Hegel. And the reason why I did philosophy at college was because I was a Marxist and wanted to understand Hegel so I could better understand Marx, which is ironic. Because then when I read Hegel, I thought Hegel's a lot brighter than Marx and a lot more sophisticated. But one of his critiques of, say, Descartes was that, Descartes was really after an established epistemology, the sort of science of how do we get true and certain knowledge about the world. And he said, we should be skeptics and question, is knowledge really true? And what Hegel pointed out is, well, but aren't you already assuming a shed load of stuff when you make that claim? You're basically assuming there's like a subject on the one side, there's some external objective world on the other side, and there's this thing in the middle called knowledge. And you're asking, can you get knowledge that coincides with the objective, which could be known by the subject? So there's already sort of these massive assumptions and breaking down the world into subjects and objects, even at the heart of Western Enlightenment thought in terms of even skepticism. And Hegel was interesting because he said, actually, no, we can't be separate. Otherwise, we couldn't know the world and we can experience the world. So those three things actually collapse into what in Western philosophy they call idealism, which led, I think, to more postmodern thought and existentialism. But it's interesting again, and we can't talk about it in detail now. But it ultimately fell into nihilism again.
I think when Lama Jampa says that, you know, we feel something in the loss of the subject, we still, of course, have, as Paul was pointing out, we do in Buddhism have our critique of the subject-object distinction, just as Hegel had. We also have a very sophisticated critique of that. I think what Lama Jampa is pointing to when he says we still feel a loss in the loss of the subject is that what happened in the West with the Enlightenment was that the subject got lost, but the object didn't get lost. The object got turned into this hyper-real focus. So yeah, we need to bring the subject back to bring things more back into balance from a conventional point of view. But yeah, but that's also caveated with the point that in Buddhism, ultimately, the subject-object distinction is also a delusion.
Yeah, 100%. And this is the next chapter on science and scientism. We'll go into this in more detail. So maybe go on to the final point Lama Jampa makes, which is that finally Buddhism recognizes that positive change in the external world and society must start with a transformation in our own hearts and our interactions with those around us, and not just the lofty ideals of political ideologies used to justify violence and tyranny.
What? So you're saying that my vote doesn't count? That all of the time and energy I just invested into like this election was a waste of time? But what about the perfect external utopia that I'm looking forward to for the next 4 years, and then the next 4 years after that ad infinitum? You're saying that was a waste of my time? I should have spent more time doing...
Well, I guess we'll find out pretty quick.
Well, that's depressing.
It will be interesting to see how quickly we find out, because every election has its honeymoon period. I mean, not for everyone, obviously, but for the people who who voted and won, or whatever you call it, there's often a honeymoon period, isn't there? And even some of the people who didn't vote will think, oh, there's a new thing here, might be all right, give it a chance. And inevitably, it's a massive, massive disappointment. So we'll see how long the honeymoon period lasts this time.
It's that whole, I like the analogy of the Russian doll, because it is like that. It's that no matter how, even if it is an improvement, there's always room to constantly improve and tweak the external world. It's never going to be, all right, we're there now, perfect paradise sorted. We're all inhabiting it, and we all have inner defilements.
But that's also, isn't it, partly why that utopia will never manifest? Because we are all deluded beings driven by the disturbing emotions. You can't get to this utopia. You can create this idea, isn't it, of a utopia and justify why we want that utopia, because we want everyone to be happy and we want everyone to be free for stuff. So we're going to create this utopia. But of course, the utopia can never come because we're all stuck in samsara, in our own delusion. So it's a promise that can never manifest, and yet a promise that can justify almost any tyranny, as we've seen over the last 100+ years.
It's compelling because we keep going back to it. Apparently, we don't learn.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly what I was going to say. The obstacle to the space for Buddhism on this fourth point is that even though we've had this democratic system now for hundreds of years, and it always seems to go the same way, nobody seems to really be losing any faith in it. If anything, faith in it is increasing. Faith in its ability to deliver utopia, that is increasing. You see that around the excitement around these elections. So although Buddhism offers an alternative, it seems to be there's some real challenges there with politics still convincing people for some reason that it's got some answers. It's
been a really good discussion. It covered a lot of different ground. So, and next week we'll start on chapter 2 on science. Good chatting, lads, and until next time.